Everyone. This is Maria Sanchez-Keene. Welcome again to Fundamentals in Practical Leadership, for new and emerging leaders. This is session 3, Influence with Formal and Informal Leadership. And I want to highlight the quote that we start with this today. In organizations, real power and energy is generated through relationships. The patterns of relationships and the capacities to form them are more important than tasks, functions, roles, and positions. And so today we really want to talk a little bit about that whole idea of influencing with formal and informal leadership. We want to begin, as we often do, just by reminding you that we are going to be using a variety of ways to interact. We'll be using the chat. We'll have some interactive polls through the chat. The session will be recorded for your reference. And if you're lost in terms of where to come back, always look for the Zoom icon, hit on it, and you'll get back to the slides. So as a manager and a leader, you now have authority, or you've had it for a while, whether you are managing a project or whether you are leading a team or a larger organization as a director. We really want to talk a little bit about what authority means. How do you exert formal authority? How do you implement change with what authority, from formal or informal authority? Where does power in an organization lie? And what are the things that you need to know as you think about yourself as a leader from the perspective of authority and power? And so what we want to talk about today is, how do leaders get things accomplished? What are the things that you need to grow and develop in order to do that? And how are people moved and inspired to do that, to do what is necessary to accomplish the vision? So let's talk a little bit about some great leaders. What I'd like you to do, just as we have in the past, is if you can put your name in the chat, please. See if people can put their name in the chat. Thanks, Lindsay. I'll just wait for everybody to get their name in. Awesome. Thank you so much. See lots of people joining. Excellent. All right. Good. So as we have in the past, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a poll in the chat, and you'll have an opportunity to respond to the question that comes up. And so the question, so I want you to think about a really great leader, someone that you think, you know, I admire this person, I've learned from them, they've mentored me. What is it about that leader, the qualities of that leader that really stand out to you? So I'm placing the link on the chat now. If you want to just hover over the link and click on it, it will take you to the poll that says, name the 3 qualities that stood out for you of this great leader that you're thinking about. This will be an opportunity for you to just put those 3 qualities, and look at that, transparent comes up 3 times already. And again, you can vote, upvote the ones that you agree with. Transparent, listens, compassionate, kind, common sense, shared experience. Experiences, supportive, good listener. Compassion, positivity, fair, saw us as a team. Courageous, vulnerable, influential. Open, friendly, knowledgeable. Great answers. I love how transparent is coming right to the top there. We'll have a good conversation about that today. Positive, trustworthy, inclusive, approachable, friendly, honest, fair, open, approachable, some great words, grace, expertise, and empathic. Excellent. Thank you. So in fact, a lot of the words that you are naming now are the words that really do make great leaders. And we'll talk a little bit about this from the perspective of this aspect of authority and this element of really trying to think about how you can influence change, or how you can influence as we move forward, and thinking about authority. So thank you for this. So I'll ask you to go back to the Zoom. So just look for the Zoom link, or minimize that screen that you're on, and you should be seeing the hands that say some great leaders. And I'll share some of that now in terms of some of the great leaders that I've seen. One of the ones, and I know Carrie will share one as well, For me, I was a woman when I was a really young leader. I was in my 20s. And this was a very, I would say, very, very influential leader in the organization that I was working with. And what I admired most about her was that she anchored her leadership in relationship. And she listened carefully. She was really empathic. I think that's so many of the words that you were articulating there. And yet she was able to get things done. She was able to move a vision. She was able to engage people. She was able to challenge us, really see out our gifts and call us to live out those gifts. And at the same time, there was a person that put it there in terms of a fair person. She also was an individual who could challenge you no matter what. And yet, the way that she challenged you left you feeling still really intact. So while there were things that you needed to change, it didn't take away from your dignity or leave you kind of scarred from the experience. She was really powerful, and I still continue to see her as someone that I continue to see as a great role model. So I'm going to turn it over to Carrie, who's going to share an example from her experience.
Thanks very much, Maria, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll tell you a little bit about an individual that I worked with for about 10 years in primary care. His name is Tom Freeman. He's a physician, and he was the person who was the chair of the board when I was hired into the primary care organization that I worked with. He was on the board for most of the time that I was the executive director there. Took a couple of years off partway through. He is somebody who has great authority from sort of his knowledge base. He's a world-known researcher and is often asked to present at conferences around the world. For about 7 of the years that we worked together, excuse me, he was the chair chief of family medicine, but not for the whole time. He retired from that while we were working together. And again, he was the board chair for a while. He was on the board for a while, and sometimes he wasn't on the board, but he worked in the organization the whole time that I was there as well. And Tom is someone who comes from, again, a very, very strong knowledge background. He certainly had positions of formal authority, multiple positions of formal authority, but he is also someone who is very much a servant leader, and I would say leads from behind in many respects. Very soft-spoken individual, quite quiet and thoughtful. One of those people that when they do speak, everybody is very quiet so that they can hear them, because everybody really wants to hear what he has to say. He supports change significantly. He uses authority or influence really the same way, regardless of whether he has a formal authority or not in a particular position. You don't see him change as he has different hats on and is leading or supporting from a particular place. And in particular, one thing that really captures Tom for me, I chatted with him this past fall. It's probably been about 2 years since we last worked together. And I asked what he was up to. He's well beyond the age that many folks would be retired. He's still doing a little bit of family practice. He's still doing his research. But what really encompasses who Tom Freeman is that he was spending as much of his time as possible in the COVID assessment centers, doing shifts in the COVID assessment centers. So again, that kind of leader that would never ask anybody else to do something that they're not prepared to do themselves either. I greatly admire him, and I'm glad that we're able to stay connected. So we'll move, if we could, Maria, on to the next slide. And that's speaks to hopefully some of what you've heard as Maria and I were sharing our great leaders that we've worked with, that leaders who are truly great really look at capturing both the hearts and the minds of people that they work with, of people that they serve. And that's something that's going to be a bit of a theme for us as we make our way through the rest of the presentation today. So I want to get into some theory and look at the 6 sources of influence on human behavior. Because really, quite often, when you're doing leaderful things, when you're asked to do things as a manager, it relates to change management, and it relates to changing behavior. Sometimes it's supporting people to keep going in an existing behavior. Sometimes it's changing behavior because they're not in the place you need them to be. And sometimes it's changing behavior because somebody is doing really well and you want to support them to keep moving forward and succeeding. So as often there's a link at the bottom of this slide to get you to a resource that talks a little bit more. This model comes from Vital Smarts. And really what we want to talk about is there's likely 2 things going on in any case with somebody. Again, whether you're planning for change, you can use this model, making sure you've covered all of your bases, or you're sort of trying to address a particular team or a particular individual to support change. And the 2 factors at play are often ability. So do they have the training, the tools, the resources to get things done? And that's often on the management side of your role. The other side is, are people motivated to do what it is that you're asking them to do? So again, that's the hearts and minds. That's really what you're doing as a leader. And in both of those areas, there could be 3 different levels of things that you need to think about. Again, whether you're planning a change and wanting to make sure you have all your ducks lined up, or you're supporting somebody through a change where they're having some challenge, or you're asking them to change because there's things they need to do differently. So we'll go down those 3 categories on the ability side first. And that is, a fairly straightforward personal ability. Do they have the training to do what you've asked them to do? Do they understand the task? Do they have the tools themselves to do the work? Social ability. Quite often you see that come up where somebody's challenged to do what you're asking them to do because they're not getting what they need from somebody else. The team isn't working together the way that you would hope they would. There's somebody in a different department that's making it challenging for them to implement the work that you're asking them to. And then there's always the structural. So from a system perspective, is the system allowing them to do what it is that you're asking them to do, to make the change that you're asking them to make? Are there structural tools? Is the medical record system, the client tracking system actually able to do what it is they need to do to get their job done? So with your management hat on, you want to think about ability at all of those levels. And then we move over to the motivation side and go down those levels again. Do they have the personal motivation that you're looking for? And if not, why? Digging a little bit into that. Is somebody afraid of a particular change? Is somebody just not understanding and needs some more help understanding what the change is and what they're being asked to do? Again, on the social side, is there a team dynamic or relationships in the team? So the social side on ability is the team isn't actually getting done together what needs to get done for a particular reason. On the motivation side, what is the culture of the team? What is the culture of the people they need to work with? Are they supportive of each other and what needs to happen? And finally, on the structural side, again, I'll use the term culture, which is an incredibly important word. Is the system supportive of the change or what you're asking them to do? Is the culture there to really enable people to embrace what it is that you're asking them to do? So we'll move to the next slide. And I want to talk a little bit here about power. And as Maria and I worked on this presentation, we had a lot of interesting conversations about what language we were going to use, and particularly sort of that hesitancy around the term power. It has a lot of negative connotations, but it is in fact the accurate word for what we're talking about. So we decided we would use it because we think it's important, A, to take some of the negative connotation out of it, hopefully, and B, to recognize that it is something that's at play at any point in time as a leader and a manager. So a dictionary definition of power is the ability to get an individual group to do or not do something. And when you have power, you have many different means of doing that, many different types of power. Two subsets of power are authority and influence. So again, one type of power is your authority. That is a formal right. You can require people to do the things or not do the things that you're asking them to do. And then another subcategory is influence. Influence is about acknowledging people's free will, not using your formal right to require them to do something, but affecting their behavior without coercion and without that formal right. And you can, I'm sure, think about a number of leaders, managers, individuals that you've come across and worked with that use these different types of power in different ways. So let's dig in a little bit further to the sources of power. Where does power come from when we look at the literature? And again, there are a number of different types of power. And what's really interesting about it is only one of them is tied to authority. The other four really are about influence. So we'll start with the authoritative type of power. And that is, again, your positional power, your structural power, the fact that you have the ability to reward or punish people for behavior, what they do and what they don't do. And that type of power is one that, you know, we don't want to be overusing. And I would argue that we don't want to be underusing it either. There are times where positional and structural power does need to come to bear. You're working with somebody who has blatantly abused a policy. You're working with someone where you've been through a couple of steps of coaching and support, and it's time to move to a progressive discipline type of scenario. So again, while I think a lot of us, particularly in the industries that those of us who are on this webinar tend to work in, we shy away a little bit from that. And it's important to know when to use it appropriately. The second type of power that we have is an influential power. As I said, the rest of them are, and it's referent. So you have an approach that really develops respect from people. You have strong interpersonal relationships. As Maria mentioned further, relationships can be a really significant and powerful source of influence and power. Informational power is influence. Now, you could sometimes use that in an authoritative way, but if you have information that others don't have, then you have informational power. If you are distributing information in a particular way in order to influence and support people to affect a change, that is informational power. So again, that can be, most of these can be abused, and all of these have their place to be used at particular times. So again, as you're developing a change management plan, what is the information you want to provide to people so that they are motivated, so that they have the ability to do what you're asking them to do? Expert power is a really subject area. You have in-depth expertise in a subject area. People know that and they trust and respect, therefore, what you're going to say or do in a particular area. I'd mention as well, if you don't have in-depth expertise in a particular subject area, but there's work that you need to do in that area, you can borrow somebody else's expert power. You can bring somebody along with you as a co-lead on a project that does have that in-depth expertise. You can make sure that you're having lots of meeting where you're digging in with the folks who do have that expertise. So if you have it, fantastic. If you don't have it, the way you go about dealing with the fact that you don't have it can also really build trust and respect. And then reciprocal power is another means of influence. So, you know, whether it's working within your own organization, whether it's working with another organization, If they've got a goal, if somebody that you're trying to work with has a goal and you can support them in achieving that goal, they're going to be far more likely to come to the table and want to talk to you about supporting your goal. So again, this isn't about manipulating people. This is about, we have common goals. We have goals that really align with each other. Why wouldn't we work together and support each other related to that? So if we can move on to the next slide, there really is, there's a broad spectrum of how a leader and a manager uses each of those tools. A leader and manager who relies on high authority is really focused on timelines and efficiency, is very effective for binary issues. So if it's a yes/no issue, if there are, there's a good case on both sides, and a decision has to be made, then that high authority, okay, we need to go this way. Recognize that both ways have pros and cons, but we have to pick one and move forward. Very effective for that. Very effective when dealing with safety and legislation, regulation, supporting people with implementing policy, which goes to the next one. If you have a required behavior, and in particular, if that required behavior could cause a safety issue for staff, for clients, then high authority is a place to consider going for that. And high authority also really works where there's no room for interpretation. We're not sort of collaborating on a final definition, or if we have collaborated on a definition, the definition now stands and it must move forward the way that it stands. So again, safety issues, sometimes it's issues associated with best practice or emerging best practice. This is the way we're going to do things because the evidence shows us it's the right way to go. And then you have a continuum, and when we get to the other end of it, somebody who uses high influence, and when it's appropriate to use high influence is when you're looking at, again, bringing people along in their hearts and minds. High influence is going to support motivation and creativity in the people that you're working with. You're going to be collaborating, you're going to be asking them lots of questions, you're going to be inviting them along the process with you. It works to support dialogue and understanding. However, it can take a lot longer. So if you're working through a collaborative process, if you're consensus building, it's most of the time going to take a lot longer than something that moves a little bit closer to the high authority end. So if you're in an urgent situation, again, if a binary decision needs to be made, if it's related to safety, you probably don't want to take a high influence approach to that. And of course, it requires trust and respect in both directions. You need to trust and respect the folks that you're working with, and they need to trust and respect what you are doing as a leader and a manager. So we're going to pop open another poll for you. Again, if you go into the chat box, it will give you the link so that you can click on it and respond to the poll. And what we're asking you to do is just look at that spectrum and put a little dot on the place on that spectrum you feel most comfortable in your leadership. There we go. Thanks, Maya. So we've got first person right in the middle. Yeah, a good split on either end, and lots of folks in sort of different places on the spectrum as far as being in the middle. I think it's important to recognize that everybody does have their own comfort zone as far as the different ways that you can use your power as a leader and a manager to influence or also to require people to do things using that authority. So something to think about. Thank you all for your responses. Something to think about related to where you are and where are the levels that you're not as comfortable, and what are the things you can think about related to, is it that you struggle with picking the right time to utilize high authority, for example, if you're a high influencer, or is it just that influence works for you most of the time? And if it does, do you have that sense of when to use authority? On the other hand, if you're really comfortable in high authority, Are there things that you can practice to make sure that you're also comfortable at the other end of the spectrum? So thank you very much for your responses to that, and I will hand the webinar back to Maria.
Thanks very much, Carrie. So we'll just ask you to minimize that and go back to Zoom. You should be able to see the slides now. So we're going to spend a little bit of time now talking about the high influence side. And as Carrie mentioned, this aspect of power and that use of that word is so foreign sometimes to us, but as a leader, it is what you have. And part of what we want to talk a little bit about is really honing in on our influencing skills, where leaders and managers should really live most of the time. So we want to try to come at things as much as possible, given some of the examples that Carrie mentioned where it wouldn't make sense, but trying to really think about how do we actually expand our ability to influence. So I want to just reference here the Center for Creative Leadership. There's a link there, and there'll be a few as we go through this part of the webinar. But I really appreciated the way that they kind of articulated areas in which we need to really think about growing if we want to become leaders that lead from that place of influence where appropriate. And so what they talk about are 4 key areas: organizational intelligence, team promotion, trust building, and leveraging networks. And so we're going to go through each of these and I'll provide some examples. So organizational intelligence is really coming to an understanding as a leader that in all of our organizations, there are formal and informal structures. So we need to understand really how things get done. So we know that there's the organizational structure and we know who reports to whom, but also we know that in each of our organizations, there are people that hold power, not by their position, but by their influence, their reputation, the number of years that they've been there, their outspokenness sometimes. And for you as a leader, it's important to have an understanding of both the structural sense of how power is provided, but also the informal way. And I can think of some people who, for example, are gatekeepers. They have a way of managing the organization from their position, and you need to know who those people are and how you can work with them. So what does it look like for us to have organizational intelligence? So the first thing is really understanding how you can build your social capital within your organization. And so as a leader, it really does mean stretching out of your comfort zone. So thinking about who am I going to sit with and learn about. Even as a leader, sometimes we get comfortable with the people that we know. They may have been friends. This is a place where you feel accepted. But as a leader, part of your role is really building your social capital. And the way that we do that is by getting to know people. And not because, as Carrie said, to use them or manipulate them, but just to get to know them. So a key way of building organizational intelligence is by building your social capital, by getting to know people. It's also then thinking about not being the first to respond, but taking a place of listening and getting a sense of who speaks up, who has a real sense of what's happening, who holds, when they speak, people nod a lot. Really taking an opportunity to kind of sit back and reflect and see your organization in action. And so that allows you to get a sense of, okay, I have an understanding of how formal and informal things happen within my organization. Really developing your social intelligence, which means really beginning to pay close attention to nonverbal cues, practicing active listening, considering how people might feel, and finding ways to appeal to common good. And so for you, that might include really getting a sense of how are people coming to the table. This becomes a bit harder in our virtual reality, but it might be about checking in with people, but really, again, taking a reflective piece and being able to say, I'm just going to pay attention to how people respond. When someone speaks, are they crossing their arms? Are they looking down? Are they distracted? Would another person speak? Do they need to be more attentive? Are they really listening? That gives you a sense of the organizational intelligence of what happens. So building good rapport and cooperative relationships is a part of moving towards influencing, and understanding how your organization works from both a formal and informal part really helps you to build your leadership from that perspective of using authority from an influencing angle. The second part of it is team promotion. And so part of what we want to do is ensure that you are taking that aspect of building team very seriously. And that might be if you're on a project, if you have a team, if you're a director, all of the people that are working with you. And thinking about if you want to influence this group of people, you need to spend time with them. They need to know you as a leader. They need to know that you have their back. They need to know that you're going to celebrate with them when it's time to celebrate. Something that came up a lot as we were starting our webinar today is transparency. So really being sure that you are a person that is sharing information readily, obviously having an understanding of what it is that you're allowed to share or can share at the time, but being really committed to making sure that the people that work with you are ones that are well informed. They don't feel like you're caught them by surprise. They feel like they know that you're going to be consistent in providing information to them. So to become an influential leader, when you need to make decisions, you need to nurture that every day of the year with your team so that you're creating a healthy and collaborative workplace so that when change comes, there's already an environment that you've created in order for people to get on side and help you as you need to make the change that you need to. So it is about celebrating successes. It's about leaning in and stepping up as a leader. So leaning into the conversation, leaning into your team, leaning into opportunities to learn, and stepping up and taking responsibility or leadership. So really, not just you, but your team being promoted and doing those pieces. Also, it is about delivering on your commitments with real accomplishment. So one of the things that people get lost in sometimes when we're thinking about influencing aspects is that we interpret that to mean unless we're having ongoing dialogue all the time, we're not being collaborative or influential in our leadership. And in fact, influence doesn't mean you don't get things done. It means you collaborate, you explain to people what you need, but you move ideas and thoughts to action. And so sometimes part of what you need to ask yourself is, do I actually know how to make collaborative decisions? Do I have the tools? Have I gone and learned how to do that? Because that's a really important skill to have in this sense of team promotion and influencing others. So really helpful tool for me, for example, is when I'm speaking to a group or a team, I'm asking, am I gathering your input? So for this agenda item, I just want your input. Am I seeking your feedback? Are we making a decision, or are we evaluating something? So one way to do it is just to be really clear with the people that you're working with on what it is that you are seeking. It's also about helping your team connect the dots. So I find that sometimes we talk about the systems changes and the transformation, and there's so many sectors that are currently going through transformation changes. And the executive director or the CEO might provide that information at a team meeting. And often you see eyes kind of glaze over and then get a sense of, well, I don't really know how that impacts me. I'm just going to continue to do the work that I normally do. As a leader, part of your responsibility is helping people connect the dots so that they're able to understand how their piece of the puzzle fits into the bigger piece of the puzzle. And that could be a really motivating factor, back to the aspects that Carrie talked about. The next is, again, another one that I think a lot of you was really talked a little bit about at the beginning. Sorry, I'm noting the comment there, Jenna. I appreciate that very much. The trust building piece is something that many of you named and is critical, again, to build day to day. And the only way really to build trust is by past history. So if you have been a person that has been consistent in your leadership, consistent in your information, consistent in how you've involved them, consistent in the way that you celebrate success, when you need to ask them to trust you, they're ready to do so. But if you have been someone who hasn't spent the time really building that in your team, at a moment when you need to say to them, can you trust me on this? People aren't ready to do that. So building trust on a day-to-day basis is really important to your relationships. And how that is built on a one-to-one is back to that situational leadership stuff. So if, as an individual on your team, I believe that you have the best interest for me and you're providing with me with what I need in terms of direction and support, I know that I can count on you. And that puts more and more trust in the trust bank. So the types of things that foster trust, you can't make someone trust you, you can foster that, and you do that by your actions, is open and ongoing timely communication, that transparency piece that we talked about. You need to be thinking about, am I being able to exemplify trustworthy behavior? And the way that we do that is by our actions, our behaviors, our mindset, and even the symbols that we use. So how are we checking in? How are we keeping our stories of things that are confidential within our team? How are we ensuring that our actions match what we said? That's trustworthy behavior. It also is about how you address challenges. And in another webinar, we'll be talking about conflict. But if I know that you are going to address things fairly, that you don't have favorites, that you follow policy, that you use authority when you need to, I begin to have a sense of who you are. And in that consistency, I build trust with you. So part of it, again, as we're thinking about these webinars, is what skills do I need to have? What actions do I need to move toward? What does my mindset need to be in order to build trust in my team or with the people that I work with? Because when I need to ask for something to move forward, or they need to trust me because we don't have all the information, it's not going to happen at that moment. It happens every day as you go through. A big one, of course, and we all can talk about this, is acting with integrity. And a simple way to remember that, because integrity is something we talk a lot about, we have different definitions for it, but the simplest one for me is say A, do A. So if you say you're going to do something, you follow through. And if you can't, then you circle back and explain why you can't. So that builds trust and builds your ability to work from a position of influence when we think about authority. So all of these aspects foster loyalty. And that is what allows you to come back to your team in full integrity and genuineness to say, hey, this is what we're doing now. This is what I've been asked to do. This is what this team has been asked to do. And I ask you to join me in doing those pieces. And the last one is about leveraging your networks. So again, something that might be really interesting for you to do is to think about, how much am I expanding my networks as a leader? And this doesn't mean I have to sit at every community partners table there is. It's more about, what are the relationships that I need to nurture to be able to have them when I need them, to be able to seek more advice, bring in an expert, call on someone to assist me. And so it is about cultivating connections and the power of networks, understanding that, as Carrie mentioned, you're not going to know all of it, but you're going to have relationships in your field that you can pull in as you need to. So again, it goes way beyond the official structures to the informal networks that are building within your organization. So what does it look like? It's developing your mindset to see your work and your organization, your community, your sector as a network. And so sometimes a helpful exercise is with your team to say, okay, here's our work. Let's mind map all of the ripple effects of our work, all of the different people that it touches. And are there things that we can do out there that will help us advance the work that we need to do to continue with the mission of our organization? So that idea, even as you're making a decision, being able to pause and say, who is this decision going to impact? Let's think about our stakeholders, and let's think about how this decision will impact them and how we're going to prepare people that this decision is going to impact for this change, whether that's clients or caregivers, children, adults, whether it's staff, whether it's some of your community partners. Thinking about your stakeholders, how your decisions are going to impact them, and planning for really good information to be prepared for them so that they feel supported for the change is a key way in which you use your ability to influence as your authority. So these are, again, are things for you to be thinking about as you think about growing your leadership from the perspective of influence. So how am I building relationships? How am I really thinking about organizational intelligence and building that? How am I promoting my team, celebrating my successes? How am I building trust so that people have an understanding of the fact that I've built loyalty and I'm trustworthy? And how am I leveraging networks? So as we think about that continuum that Carrie presented, I'm talking about this side of things where we believe most of us need to live most of the time, in things that you can do concretely to continue to expand that way of leadership. So, time for a poll. So I'm going to, again, just put up the link. And what we want to do is just talk a little bit about this aspect of it, and come at it now from where do you think you, I think this is where you click on which of the 4 keys to influencing others do you have the highest level of competency? So organizational intelligence, you would click 1, team promotion, team building, or leveraging networks. Just to get a sense of where we're at. We want to build on our strengths as we go forward. So look at that, trust building is so high. It's excellent. Okay. Yeah, so really think about it. That's so much to celebrate, that level of trust building that you have and how you go about doing that. Thank you. So we'll go to the next one, which of course is the other side of this. So which of the 4 key ways to influence others do you have the lowest level of competency, or the area that you think, oh, I really need to grow that? Yeah, that leveraging networks piece. So I encourage you to think about, okay, in my work, what are the networks that are really important to advancing the work that I need to do? Who are the people that within those networks that I would love to get to know? Who are the top 3 people that I can just start doing an informational interview with, having a coffee with, saying, hey, can we have a 15-minute Zoom call and getting to know them? Where are the places that I really need to leverage networks? And that can be both internal and external. So one of them, for example, might be, you know what, it's the IT department. I count on them so much. I really need to get to know that team. Set up an appointment with someone that you think could really help you advance your work and get to know them and get to know, you know, what their priorities are, where their work is landing them. So it doesn't have to be anything big to begin to leverage your networks. Again, I don't want you to leave thinking that now you have to join as many community partner tables as possible, but it is about really honing in on where are there areas that I could really strengthen in terms of this work, and how do I move that forward? So with that, I'll ask you to just come back to Zoom, and hopefully you'll see the results of where we are at, and I'll turn it back to Carrie to look at the flip side of this.
Absolutely, yes. Thanks for that, Maria. That's such a fantastic deep dive into the influence side of the work that we do as leaders and managers. And again, recognizing that that is where we want to be quite a bit of the time. But as I mentioned earlier, there is a place for authority. And I want to spend a little bit of time with you just walking our way through thinking about that, where authority makes sense to use in your journey as a leader and a manager. So there's a number of items here. Some of them I've already referred to a little bit as we were talking earlier. But recognition, private and public praise. So Maria talked about that, sort of talked about celebrating successes with your team as a piece of influence, and it absolutely is. And also think about that your position as a manager or a leader sometimes adds that little bit of extra oomph to a recognition that is going out. So an example from that perspective is I've been working with a team recently in an organization, and there was somebody on that team who just really embraced the work and dove right in. I provided that feedback to the individual myself. And then I actually also connected with the executive director of that organization to say, hey, I thought you should know, I know this project is important to you, sort of you've asked us to move it forward. And this particular individual is, is really going above and beyond. So that not only could the individual hear it from a team member or a colleague, but also got that message from the CEO or executive director of the organization to say, hey, I've been noticed for doing the work that I do. So your position gives you a bit of a unique opportunity from that perspective. You can use authority to expand reach, and in particular, you can lend your authority to others when expanding reach. So sometimes it's about, asking people to come into a conversation who might be reluctant to do so if they were asked by somebody who they sort of feel is a colleague, but you're asking them as a leader manager. It brings them into the conversation. It gives them an understanding that it's necessary for them to come into the conversation. And then the conversation itself can be an influential, collaborative conversation. But sometimes, again, you need that little extra oomph to get folks to a table. One of the things that I actually really drives me nuts about leadership and management sometimes is that somebody's asking for something. One of your team members is asking for something from somebody else and not getting anywhere. And them CCing you on the next ask sometimes actually gets the other person moving. Again, it bothers me when that happens. I think people should be respecting and responding to people and working together regardless. However, sometimes that doesn't happen, and lending your authority by saying, yeah, include me on that email, and the other person will see that you're included on the email, can be a way to use your authority. Again, we talked a bit about sort of a binary issue or a simple issue with multiple potentially right answers. And really what the team needs is a final decision. It's a simple issue. They don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about it. They recognize that there's multiple different ways that we can do this, and all of them would be an okay way of doing it. They're looking to you and saying, can you please just tell us how to move forward with this? We don't have a lot invested in it. It's not going to make a huge difference. Just if you could do that for us. We talked about urgency. We talked about issues of safety and legislative and policy. I want to spend a minute on the last 20% because quite often you're in a change management initiative and you're working with people from a place of influence to try and move people forward, get them to understand and accept and adapt. But then you get to the place where 80% of people are with you and 20% really are struggling to come along. And if the change must be implemented, then you may need to use your authority for that last 20%. But I do hesitate. I do say, please use that cautiously, because what you don't want to do is be in a position where you've said to people, we're making this change, we're going to do it collaboratively, we're going to work together, it's going to be consensus building. You bring a whole bunch of people along and then you sort of flip it, or it looks like you flipped to an authoritative mode and said, okay, the rest of you were just doing it now. Because then you've sent out a message that it never really was sort of an influential, collaborative, consensus building kind of process. You could potentially send that message out if you don't, again, use that cautiously. You want to think about being able to say to people, okay, the first 80% are there and it's working, and therefore we're now going to switch to a place where it is required. Make sure you're thinking about how you're using that and not coming across as somebody who is inauthentically collaborative. HR issues, again, we talked a bit about some of those, and really in the beginning when we were talking about the difference between management and leadership, that is your management hat, ensuring the order within the organization that allows people to do their job, focus on the vision, focus on the mission. And using authority generally becomes something that you need to think about when you're responding to boundary testing. So somebody who is boundary testing generally knows that they're boundary testing. They're doing it. And I'll give you a quick example. when I was a new manager in an organization I had worked in before, and somebody who was on my team implemented something that they had no authority to do. They actually stopped a service that they had no authority to stop. So, went right to the individual, said, first of all, that is outside of your authority. You cannot stop the service. We need to restart the service right now. And then also took the time to say, once we sort of got that side sorted out, okay, help me understand why you felt you needed to take that step, because I think you knew that you didn't have the authority to do it. So what was happening? And got to have conversations about her frustrations with some of the service providers and how they weren't, again, sort of following rules and that kind of thing. And we're able to move on and create a plan. And this individual and I ended up having a really trusting, respectful relationship, but I couldn't respond to that boundary testing in any way other than saying, no, this isn't something that you can do, so that she knew that boundary testing wouldn't sort of be allowed. But then I also allowed her to see, but we can talk about things and we can deal with issues and we can work together on things. So be empathetic, be composed, but be firm about the boundary that has been crossed. And if we can move on to the next slide, please, Maria. Just a little bit more on how to use it wisely. And Maria talked a bit about, from the influence side, talked a little bit about this. Tell people up front how a decision is being made. So let them know what to expect. So don't walk into a room and start talking to people about something, getting input, and then at the end say, okay, I've made my decision, this is what it's going to be. Because when you walked in and started getting input, they might have thought, okay, this is going to be a collaborative decision. If you say up front, this is a decision that I'm going to need to make and take accountability for, but I want your input into it, then they know exactly what to expect as they're engaging with you. And again, do use it when appropriate. By not using authority when it's appropriate, you can get yourself into a position where somebody thinks something's up for negotiation that absolutely is not up for negotiation. And then you need to back your way out of that situation. And again, that respect and trust may not be there in the same way. And of course, be humble and realize for yourself, as well as making sure other people realize you are not using your authority simply because you have authority to use. You use it when the situation calls for it. And you can be authoritative without being an authoritarian type of leader. Do it with confidence. Be clear that this is about accomplishing the job at hand. This isn't about the fact that I, have this title or that title. This is about what we need to do to move forward together. You are using your authority in support of and on behalf of the organization. So again, this isn't one person, the term power trip comes up. This isn't one person doing that. This is my job, what I need to do on behalf of the organization in my role. And again, you do not have to be perfect yourself in order to use authority. You will have made a misstep here and there. So model that candor and latitude when appropriate. I know that I also wasn't entirely clear on this at one point, but now I am, and I need to make sure you're clear as well. If it is appropriate to give people a little bit of latitude, but then make sure that they do understand what's needed. And again, there's a resource at the bottom of that slide to support you. So I will hand us back to Maria to wrap things up. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carrie. So it was really important for us to really try to provide that balance, not seeing as one or the other, but the balance of the two, that there is obviously a big place for influence, but there is also obviously a place for authority. And what's helpful, I think, is for you as a leader to understand that you do have power because of position or because of what the work that you're doing. And the way that you exercise that, you have a lot of room within a continuum to do it in a way that makes sense. The more aware that we become of how we can use our power with respect to authority and with respect to influence, we believe the better you become as a leader. So we want to share with you that there is a handout that's available to you in the webinar portal for you to be able to access what you need related to that checklist of influence of the skills that you need to develop with respect to that. And then we just move to the post-webinar certificate before we do a quick checkout. So for those of you who are doing it, many of you, it's been really good to read your responses. You should be, if you haven't yet received, I know Kathleen sent them along, the marking for the first one. And I know we've seen many come in for the second one. And here's the third. So the third is due June 28th at 12 p.m. That's when our next webinar is. 3 pages max, as always. So what we'd like you to do is recall a leader that you most admire, as we did at the beginning. Think about their use of power in the continuum of authority and influence, and reflect on your experience of them as leaders and their use of power, authority, and influence. Back to really tying what we talked about today. Second question, think about your own leadership and your relationship with power. How has our webinar informed your understanding of power, authority, and influence? And thirdly, what 3 things did you learn from the webinar that you think you can start implementing now as you grow your leadership style and skills? Okay, so that will all be posted and available for you following the webinar. And so we'll close as we usually do. We'd love to get a sense of what this was like for you. So we'll go back to the polls for our last piece. The link is there. You can type in your word and then come back so that you can see what other colleagues are saying. So get this up. What is one word to describe how you are leaving our session? Type in your word. Thank you, Callie. I see that Kathleen will respond to you, Callie, via email. Thank you. And seeing some of the words come up. So inspired, empowered, relevant, insightful, and invigorated. Affirming, intrigued. Awesome. Ideas. Refreshing. Tired, yeah. Refreshed. Relevant. Balanced. Influencer, awesome. Clarity, excellent. Okay. Well, we want to thank you again for being with us through the webinars. We will see you on June 28th. And after that one, we'll continue in September. Thanks very much and have a great rest of your Monday. Take care. Bye-bye.